Give me those keys right now! You are not going anywhere! This all belongs to me!
My husband tried to give away the house my parents bought me. Then one sentence made his father go pale. The moment my husband held out his hand and demanded the keys to my house, I knew my marriage was already over. But his father did not know that yet. He stood in my living room, pointing at bedrooms as if he were assigning cabins on a cruise ship. My mother-in-law was measuring the windows for curtains she had never been invited to choose. My husband's younger brother was already talking about moving his gaming setup into the upstairs office. Then my husband looked at me and said, "Give me the spare keys. Dad wants copies made for everyone tonight." I smiled, placed one hand over my pregnant belly, and said the sentence that made his father's face lose all its color. "Before you make copies, Gerald, you should know the bank already has the forged loan application." Hello. My name is Claire Morgan, and this is the story of how the house my parents bought to protect me became the trap that exposed my husband's entire family. To understand how I reached that moment, you need to know something about my parents. My father Daniel spent 31 years repairing industrial machines at a factory outside Columbus, Ohio. My mother Helen worked mornings at a public elementary school and evenings doing bookkeeping for a small dental office. They were not wealthy people. They were careful people. They saved receipts. They repaired things instead of replacing them. They drove the same cars until the engines gave up. They took one real vacation during my entire childhood, and even then, my father packed sandwiches so we would not have to buy lunch on the road. When I was growing up, I sometimes felt embarrassed by how cautious they were with money. Later, I understood that every sacrifice had a purpose. They wanted me to have choices they never had. I met my husband, Ethan, when I was 28. He was charming, confident, and ambitious. He worked in commercial sales and always seemed to know exactly what to say. He opened doors, remembered birthdays, sent flowers to my office, and made my parents laugh. At first, my father liked him. My mother was more careful. After Ethan and I had been dating for 6 months, she asked me, "Does he listen when you say no?" I thought it was a strange question. "Of course," I said. But when I looked back later, I realized I had answered too quickly. Ethan did not usually fight my decisions directly. He wore them down. If I wanted to stay home, he would tell me everyone had been looking forward to seeing me. If I did not want to lend money to his brother, he would say I was making him choose between his wife and his family. If I objected to a large purchase, he would accuse me of not believing in his future. He could turn any boundary into an insult against him. Still, the first 2 years of our marriage looked normal from the outside. We rented a second-floor apartment near downtown. I worked as a medical billing supervisor. Ethan changed jobs twice, always promising the next position would be the one that made us financially secure. Then I became pregnant. At 12 weeks, I began bleeding at work. The baby survived, but my doctor warned that the pregnancy had become high risk. I was told to reduce stress, avoid heavy lifting, and stop climbing stairs whenever possible. Our apartment suddenly felt dangerous. The elevator broke almost every week, and the narrow staircase turned every trip outside into a slow, frightening test. That was when my parents made an offer that changed everything. They had been saving for retirement and had recently sold a small piece of land my grandmother left my mother. Instead of keeping the money, they wanted to buy a one-story home for me and the baby. I refused at first. I told them it was too much. My father said a safe home is not too much. My mother added, "We are not buying you luxury. We are buying you peace." They found a 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from the hospital. It had a downstairs bedroom, wide hallways, a fenced backyard, and a small room beside the primary bedroom that was perfect for a nursery. The house was more than I ever expected. But my father had one condition. The deed would be in my name only. Ethan laughed when he heard that. He said, "Fine. It's just paperwork. We're married. What's hers is mine anyway." My father did not laugh. He had already spoken with an attorney named Rebecca Lane. She prepared a postnuptial agreement stating that the house was my separate property. Ethan would have no ownership interest, no authority to borrow against it, no right to lease rooms, and no ability to move other people into the home without my written consent. Ethan complained for 2 days. He said my parents were humiliating him. He said they were treating him like a criminal. He said a real family did not need legal documents. Then my father asked him a simple question. "If you do not plan to take Claire's house, what exactly are you afraid of signing?" Ethan signed the next morning. At the time, I thought the argument was over. I was wrong. The house closed 6 weeks later. My parents helped paint the nursery pale green. My father built shelves in the garage. My mother washed every cabinet before we moved in, even though the house had already been professionally cleaned. For 3 days, I felt safe. Then Ethan began making comments. The first one sounded harmless. My brother Noah could stay here for a few weeks. His lease is ending. I said no. Noah had a job, a girlfriend, and a habit of borrowing money he never returned. Ethan frowned but let the subject drop. The next day, he mentioned that his mother hated the stairs in her townhouse. We have a downstairs suite, he said. It would make sense for her. I reminded him that the suite was for my parents when they visited, and for me if the doctor later ordered bed rest. He sighed. You always make everything about your side of the family. That was not true, but pregnancy had made me tired, and I did not want another argument. I told him we would discuss it later. He heard only the word later. A week after we moved in, I noticed an envelope on the kitchen counter addressed to Ethan's aunt, Marlene. The address was my address. When I asked Ethan about it, he said she had used our house temporarily because mail kept disappearing at her apartment. Then a package arrived for Noah. Then a bank statement came for Ethan's cousin, Travis. 3 relatives had started using my home as their mailing address. I confronted Ethan that night. He did not apologize. He said, helps them establish stability. For what? Jobs. Credit? Normal things. I told him to change every address back immediately. He promised he would. The next morning, all 3 envelopes were gone. I wanted to believe the problem had been solved, but something inside me stayed alert. 2 days later, my father came over to install a safety rail in the downstairs bathroom. While he was working, he asked whether Ethan's father had visited the house. No, I said. Why? My father showed me his phone. Gerald had sent him a message. It said we will come Sunday at 2 to inspect the property and discuss family use. I read the sentence twice. Inspect the property. My father's jaw tightened. That is what he wrote. I called Ethan immediately. He answered on the 4th ring. When I asked what his father meant, Ethan said, his old-fashioned. He uses formal words. What is family use? We have extra rooms, Claire. No, we have rooms with purposes. He became quiet. Then he said, do not embarrass me on Sunday. That sentence frightened me more than if he had shouted. It meant a plan already existed. I called Rebecca Lane, the attorney who prepared the postnuptial agreement. She told me to photograph every piece of mail that arrived for Ethan's relatives. She also advised me to review the home's public property record and place a fraud alert with the credit bureaus. At first, I thought she was being overly cautious. Then she asked, has your husband recently requested copies of your signature, identification, or tax documents? My stomach tightened. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had asked me to email him a scan of my driver's license. He claimed he needed it to add me as a beneficiary to a new life insurance policy. I had sent it. He also had access to our old joint tax returns. Rebecca became very quiet. Claire, check your credit tonight. I did. There was a hard inquiry from a private commercial lender I had never contacted. The application was listed as pending. My hands began shaking so badly that I dropped my phone. The inquiry had been made 4 days earlier, 1 day after we moved into the house. I called Rebecca again. She told me not to confront Ethan yet. She wanted time to contact the lender and request a hold on the application. That night, I lay beside my husband and listened to him breathe. He slept peacefully. I did not sleep at all. At 6 the next morning, I went into his home office while he showered. I knew his computer password because he used the same one for everything. I searched his email for the lender's name. Nothing appeared. Then I checked the trash folder. There it was. The subject line read additional documentation required for Morgan Family Holdings loan. Morgan Family Holdings did not exist. The email referred to a loan of $280,000. The proposed collateral was my house. I opened the attached application. My name appeared beside Ethan's. My signature appeared at the bottom. It looked almost real. Almost. The curve of the C was wrong. The final stroke in Morgan was too long. Whoever had copied my signature had practiced, but not enough. The application listed the purpose of the loan as business expansion. The business belonged to Gerald. Ethan's father owned a struggling building supply company. For years, he had acted wealthy while borrowing from one relative to repay another. Ethan always defended him. He called Gerald a risk taker and said people with vision were often misunderstood. Now I understood the vision. They planned to use my parents' house to save Gerald's company. I forwarded the documents to Rebecca, then deleted the forwarding record from Ethan's sent folder. I hated myself for moving quietly in my own home, but I needed evidence before Ethan knew I had discovered anything. Rebecca contacted the lender, The loan was frozen immediately. Then she found something worse. The mailing addresses for Ethan's relatives were not random. They were meant to create the appearance that multiple members of Gerald's family already lived in the house. That could support a false claim that the property was a shared family residence connected to the proposed business. The plan was clumsy, but it was not harmless. Rebecca advised me to have a police officer present during Sunday's visit, not to make an arrest on the spot, but to prevent anyone from taking keys, refusing to leave, or claiming later that they had permission to move in. I agreed. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. On Saturday, Ethan came home with a box of blank key tags. I asked what they were for. He smiled and kissed my forehead. Organizing. That night, he placed his hand on my belly and talked to our unborn daughter about family loyalty. I stared at the ceiling and felt something inside me break. By Sunday afternoon, I was ready. My parents arrived at 1:30. My father still had paint under his fingernails because he had spent the morning finishing the nursery trim. My mother brought tea and lemon cake, determined to remain polite even though she knew what we had discovered. At exactly 2 o'clock, Gerald's black SUV stopped in front of the house. He entered without waiting for an invitation. My mother-in-law, Diane, followed him. Behind them came Noah, Noah's wife, and Gerald's sister Marlene. They had not come to visit, they had come to claim space. Gerald stood in the foyer, looked around once, and said, "This will do." No congratulations. No thanks to my parents. No acknowledgement that the house had been purchased with decades of their labor. Just, "This will do." Ethan appeared behind him carrying a small notebook. Gerald walked through the downstairs bedroom and tapped the door frame. "Marlene can take this room. Her knees are bad." Marlene nodded as if the decision had already been approved. Diane opened the closet. "I will need the left side," she said. "Gerald's things can go in the garage." My mother slowly set the cake on the dining table. Gerald moved toward the stairs. "Noah and Katie can have the large bedroom upstairs. The office is enough space for Travis when he gets back from Tennessee. The nursery can stay for now. For now. My baby's nursery could stay for now in my own house." I looked at Ethan. "What is happening?" He did not meet my eyes. "My family needs stability," he said. "We have space." He exhaled sharply, already annoyed. "Do not do this in front of everyone." Gerald turned toward me. "A house this size should serve the whole family. Ethan is the husband, he will manage the arrangements." My father stepped closer to my mother. I could see anger in his face, but he waited for me. I asked, "Did any of you bring furniture?" Noah's wife smiled nervously. "Only a few things in the truck." I looked through the front window. A rented moving truck was parked behind Gerald's SUV. That was the moment all doubt disappeared. They intended to move in that day. Ethan held out his hand. "Give me the spare keys. Dad wants copies made tonight." The room became completely silent. I placed one hand over my belly. Then I smiled. "Before you make copies, Gerald, you should know the bank already has the forged loan application." Gerald went pale, not surprised, pale. Diane turned to him. "What loan?" Ethan lowered his hand. My father said quietly, "The one using our daughter's house as collateral." Gerald recovered enough to scowl. "This is a private family matter." "No," I said. "Forgery is not a private family matter." Ethan moved toward me. "Claire, you are confused." I stepped back. The front door opened before he could reach me. Rebecca Lane walked inside carrying a thick folder. A uniformed police officer entered behind her. Noah immediately looked toward the moving truck. Marlene sat down without being asked. Rebecca introduced herself and told everyone that I was the sole legal owner of the property. She explained that no one present had permission to establish residency, receive mail, copy keys, store belongings, or enter the home after being asked to leave. Gerald pointed at Ethan. "My son lives here." Rebecca nodded. As Claire's spouse, subject to the postnuptial agreement he signed, Diane stared at Ethan. "What agreement?" I answered before he could. "The agreement stating that this house belongs only to me and cannot be used for his relatives, his father's debts, or any business loan." Diane looked as if someone had struck her. Gerald's anger turned toward Ethan. "You told me the document was meaningless." Ethan's face tightened. "It was supposed to be, we're married." Rebecca opened the folder. "The lender disagrees. So does the county recorder. So will a judge." She removed a copy of the loan application and placed it on the dining table. My false signature was visible at the bottom. The officer looked at Gerald. "Who completed this form?" No one answered. Then Ethan made the mistake that destroyed the last part of my marriage. He said, "It was not final. Not I did not do it. Not I have never seen that. It was not final." I felt my mother take my hand. The officer asked Ethan to repeat himself. Ethan looked at Gerald. His father's expression warned him to stay quiet, but fear had already separated them. Ethan pointed at the papers. Dad said it was only to show the investor we had collateral. He said the application could be withdrawn before closing. Gerald, what did you do? Gerald snapped. I was saving the company. With my house. I asked. With an asset that was sitting unused, he said. My father finally stepped forward. Unused. His voice was low, but everyone heard it. My daughter is carrying her first child. We bought this home so she would be safe. You looked at that safety and saw collateral. Gerald rolled his eyes. Do not act noble. You bought the house to control them. My father did not raise his voice. We protected her because your son gave us reasons to. Ethan turned to me. Claire, I was going to pay the loan. You would never have lost the house. You hid the application. Because you panic. You forged my signature. Dad handled the paperwork. Gerald's face hardened. You signed the witness section. The room froze. Ethan stared at him. In one sentence, Gerald had exposed his own son. Ethan's fear became rage. You told me it was only a draft. And you told me your wife would eventually agree. Their alliance collapsed in front of us. For months, they had acted like one powerful family against one difficult woman. Now they were two frightened men trying to place the crime in each other's hands. The officer separated them and took statements. Rebecca handed Ethan a formal notice. He was not being arrested that afternoon because the lender and investigators still needed to review the documents. But he was ordered not to remove anything from the house, copy keys, access my personal records, or contact the lender on my behalf. Then I gave him one more document, a petition for legal separation. He looked down at it. You planned this? No, I said. You planned this, I responded. His eyes moved around the house. The nursery, the staircase, the kitchen where we had eaten breakfast that morning. It was supposed to be our home, he whispered. I looked at him and finally understood the difference between us. To me, home meant safety. To him, home meant ownership. No, I said. I was supposed to be the one place where I did not have to protect myself from you. Ethan's family left one by one. Marlene apologized to my mother before walking out. Noah and his wife quietly moved their truck without unloading a single box. Diane stood in the doorway crying, but I did not comfort her. She had walked through my house choosing closet space, while I stood pregnant in the foyer. Gerald left last. Before he stepped outside, he looked at me and said, You have ruined this family. I answered, No. I stopped you from using mine. The next 3 weeks were chaos. The lender turned the file over to its fraud department. Investigators confirmed that the application had been submitted from Gerald's office. Metadata showed that Ethan had uploaded my identification and tax documents. Security footage from a copy shop showed Gerald printing enlarged samples of my signature. Gerald's investor withdrew. His company's accounts were reviewed, and several other questionable loans surfaced. Vendors who had trusted his promises demanded payment. The business did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It cracked slowly, one lie at a time. Ethan moved into his parents' basement. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had tried to assign every room in my house ended up sleeping beside boxes of old Christmas decorations because his parents' guest room was already full. He called me repeatedly. At first he apologized, then he blamed Gerald, then he blamed me. Then he offered to attend counseling if I asked the lender to clear up the misunderstanding. That was when I blocked his number and told him to communicate through Rebecca. Our daughter, Lily, was born 6 weeks early but healthy. My parents were with me at the hospital. My father cried when he held her. My mother whispered that Lily had my eyes, though newborn babies barely opened theirs. When we brought her home, the nursery was finished. The pale green walls glowed in the afternoon light. My father had built a crib from maple wood. My mother had planted white roses beside the front steps. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. Not empty, quiet. There is a difference. The divorce took almost a year. Ethan accepted a settlement after Rebecca made it clear that the evidence of financial fraud would become part of the public court record if he continued contesting my ownership of the house. He kept his car, his personal accounts, and his debts. I kept my home, full custody during the criminal investigation, and the right to raise my daughter without asking permission from people who believed family loyalty meant surrender. Gerald eventually pleaded guilty to fraud-related charges connected to the loan application and other business filings. Ethan avoided prison but received probation and lost his job after his employer learned he had used private client software to prepare false financial documents. Some people told me revenge must have felt good, But revenge was never the moment Gerald's business failed. It was not Ethan losing his job. It was not seeing their moving truck leave my driveway empty. My real revenge was quieter. It was waking up in a home where no one demanded my keys. It was watching Lily take her first steps across the living room floor Gerald once tried to divide among his relatives. It was hearing my parents laugh in the downstairs guest room that had always been meant for them. It was learning that peace is not something weak people beg for. Peace is something strong people protect. People often say a house becomes a home when it is filled with family. I do not believe that anymore. A house becomes a home when the people inside it are safe, respected, and free. And the day I refused to hand over those keys was the day I finally locked betrayal out.